Drug dealers of Reddit, have you ever called CPS on a client? If so, what's the story? So, I'm only posting because I have been clean and sober for 3.5 years now, and anything I say I have already been convicted for, and I've officially finished all of my legal issues. I have never officially called Child and Family Services, but I had this one mother who used to constantly call me for meth, and I had never been to her house before. I was a bit of a sketch bag and didn't trust anybody, but after a few months I built a relationship with her where I felt at ease going to her house. When I went to go drop some off, it was child tax day. I never knew she was a mother, normally not an issue for me, I could not care less. I walked into the house and the smell was unbelievable. Cigarettes, sweat, shit, and piss. There was broken glass on the floor, 12-inch burn circles on the floor, poop on the floors. The TV was smashed, the bathroom door was literally torn off, and in the hallway, I saw a little toddler walking around with no diaper on. He had his own poop all over him. He was so malnourished and was gray. The mother came to give me her money and I took a bag of meth. I had put it in my pocket, and I told her to buy some diapers for her kid. I told her that she would have to find her dope somewhere else, and walked away. A good friend of mine who had always tried to help me out was a social worker, and I told her who she was and where she lived, and gave her some details so she could make a final decision. I'll always remember that kid. The last I heard, he had been taken away, and the mother was in jail. I wish him the best of luck in this cruel world. I used to sell weed, X, and K around 20 years back, and I had a regular that would come to see me like clockwork every weekend. He seemed like an okay guy, excluding the drugs of course, but I can't really criticize here because I was a dealer. After a while his pickups turned into 5-minute chats, and then to 30-minute stays. During a convo he let slip that he had a son, a toddler, and that he looked after him every weekend, and that when he was at my place picking up, his kid was in the car in the back seat. He had a minivan that was windowless the whole time. And not only that, but because he didn't want to share his single bed with his kid and risk getting it urinated in, he made his kid sleep in the van outside. But it's okay, because it was locked and parked in the backyard, so the kid was safe. As soon as he let it slip, he was done as a customer. I told him to get the duck out and never come back on the threat of a severe beating. He threatened to rat me to the cops. I told him that my suppliers saw me as a decent source of income and wouldn't take it very well. He left. It rocked me so hard I felt almost concussed. I honestly couldn't process how sterile and casual he was about it all, and I knew I had to tell CPS. So I called anonymously and said I lived on this street and could hear the kid crying from the van at night every weekend, and that I had seen him incoherent and smelling of weed during the day. I never saw him again, and I don't know what happened to either him or his son, but it has stuck with me all this time, and I feel responsible for his actions in part because he did these things in pursuit of his drugs. I eventually stopped dealing and got my life together. The way I felt about this, and the realization that my actions affected people further than me than I thought, was a huge part of it. Nothing changes the fact that I contributed to that child's neglect and abuse, though, willingly or not. It makes no difference, and it's only one of the shitty, ugly things I've done that I have to live with. Back when I was younger, maybe 17, I got my first job at Domino's Pizza. One of my managers was a really scummy 24-year-old guy that looked like a troll, had astoundingly bad hygiene and also a shitty attitude, but sold good weed and bought me cigarettes. This was my first experience having older friends able to get me good stuff on demand like that. One day he hooked me up with a friend of his that was selling mushrooms, so I met with that guy and bought an ounce, and then walked to my manager's house to sell him some and also get some weed. So turns out him and his similarly aged sister, who has a 1-year-old baby, both live in makeshift bed-sheet bedrooms in the basement of the tiny house. They smoked inside, windows closed, cats everywhere, bugs everywhere, weird gross sour smells coming from all areas. Everything gross. Their mom was home, but she was senile and addicted to painkillers, as well as the sister. So we did the tray downstairs, and when I go back upstairs I go to the kitchen to throw some stuff away, and I see the baby in the high chair, eating a pack of cigarettes. He's just sitting there tearing them open and putting them in his mouth and spitting it out. I ran downstairs and told the sister, and she just started yelling, "Mom, Mom, get the baby," a couple times lazily, then gives up and goes back to just sitting there. It was surreal. I hadn't ever experienced such neglect and disgust from people. I left and waited 2 days to call CPS because I didn't want my manager to know it was me who called. I know the kids got taken away and she went to live with a different family member, or at least that's what I was told. I was a stupid teenager and thought I was a hotshot from selling coke to my peers. The money was nice, but at the time it was more for social standing. Eventually it got so out of hand that I was selling to people's uncles, fathers, aunts, and cousins. It was pretty daunting as a teenager, but like I said, the money was good and so was the social standing. Eventually I start moving heroin and one day a buddy calls me up and asks me for some. I tell him yes and ask him how much. He informs me that it's for his mom, who he doesn't live with, and we go through the whole dance of him calling her, then calling me, then calling her again to set up the deal. Eventually the amount and price gets set and I hop in my shitty old car to the next town over to make the deal. Now I'm used to shitty houses. I live on the cusp of suburbs, city, and rural, so you see all sorts of folks in your daily life. But this one was a special little shithole. The best way I can set the scene up is the scene in Breaking Bad when Jesse goes into those meth heads' house, but they weren't on meth. I've seen my fair share of dope heads, but these took the cake. It took about 30 minutes for them to let me in, and when they did, the stench was like a punch in the face. You couldn't even see the floor. All sorts of trash covering the carpet of the shitty apartment. Honestly, at this point it didn't even faze me. I made the deal and took the money. But during the awkward small talk I heard a little coo from the room over. I'm not the most confrontational person, but they were so strung out that I wasn't threatened at all. I asked them what that sound was and they said it was their baby. I immediately took stock of the room around me. Rotting food, cat feces, garbage bags everywhere. I left that apartment complex and sat in my car debating whether I would get busted if I called the police. Eventually I googled CPS and made an anonymous claim. Nothing happened to me, and the kid got taken away. Neither of them know it was me that called. I stopped selling and went through rehab in 2016. Clean ever since. Judging by their Facebooks, they're still trying to get that kid back. I really hope they don't. When I was selling to a lady, she shook her crying baby in front of me. I wigged out, took the baby, dumped $500 worth of cocaine and heroin and called 911 from my car. She didn't put up a fight until the cops came to arrest her. She tried to sue me for kidnapping. Definitely not the best strategy for me. I was 18 and addicted pretty bad. But when the baby saw a doctor under state care, he was covered in bruises, a couple of burns, and had 2 broken ribs already. I'm convinced she would have killed him. He's 10 now, happy and thriving. The whole experience and legal battle when she tried to have me charged with kidnapping is how I got sober. I pulled up to this woman's house. I was 19 at the time. She was a regular and often asked if I had any coke. I was strictly a marijuana dealer. When I walked into her house, she had 2 babies, twins, female dealer here. When I asked to use the bathroom, she said she didn't have running water due to money issues. There was a 5-gallon bucket in the bathroom to pee and poop in. This bucket was extremely full, not to mention the overflowing trash cans and tied-off trash bags in the living room. I couldn't believe how gross her house was. I panicked. I called CPS and told them I was a family friend. I drove my car down the road a little and waited for the cops to show up. I watched them pull the woman out to the house in cuffs. She turned out to have heroin in her house. I still wonder about those twins today. In the late 1990s, I used to sell reefer part-time while I was in college. One of my regular customers referred his sister to me. She called for a delivery. No big deal. I went there one time. She had 3 little kids, like a couple toddlers and an infant. Her house was full of cockroaches. I was disgusted. I called CPS, not because of the drugs and babies, but because of how filthy that house was. It caused a lot of problems for her and her boyfriend. They were in the system for a long time. Not sure how it all turned out, but fuck that woman. I used to deal way back when I was a hot mess in an extremely abusive relationship. I called CPS on not only one person, but 6. The one that sticks with me most though, not only because of the severity but because I called twice, was this couple who used to pick up from me at a laundromat. We ended up seeing each other often enough I felt okay to go to their place. I was so floored when I stepped through that door. I kid you not, they had taken up all the carpeting in the house, and had torn down the walls to get at the copper wiring and pipes. They had no electricity or running water. There was nothing in that house except for some sleeping bags in what used to be the living room. And then I noticed a nest of blankets with bright blue eyes peering at me over the pile and realized that there was a toddler and a small child no more than 5 years old. Until this point, I had never seen nor heard them talk about having kids. The poor kids were filthy and obviously malnourished. The house stunk of meth so badly I gagged. I couldn't believe it. I guess the look of shock was super apparent on my face because the dad said they were squatting and introduced me to their kids. I made some small talk and then left. The phone was ringing for CPS before I closed my car door. I gave them the address and let them know the conditions of the home, and they were squatting with 2 small children. Gave the names of the parents as I knew them and the names of the kids. They ended up going to jail for the squatting and the kids went to live with a relative. They ended up contacting me back to sell to them after they were bailed out of jail and I never responded. However, the guy I was with at the time ended up selling to them and they were living in a field in a tent with the kids. I got into a huge fight with my boyfriend over it and was so disgusted he still sold to them. I ended up calling CPS on them again. From what I heard from other people that knew them, the kids were taken permanently after that, and about a year later the mom ended up going to prison for attempted murder and the dad went to prison for check fraud some weeks after that. This is a sad story, but I'll tell it anyway because it was the past. There have been so many stories, but this one takes the cake. It's the reason I stopped selling and turned my life around. I must have been 16 or 17 at the time. I was in high school, also had a part-time job at Dairy Queen, and on top of that I had school and regular job of selling crack and heroin. I was also selling weed and cigarettes at school. This story involves a heroin and crack user. At the time of this incident, I've already been selling hard for about 1 or 2 years. Profit was pretty good, I'd say around $300 per day on average, which was great for my age, but I spent money as fast as it came. I was young and I was dumb. So as a drug dealer selling, I would use some addict's house to sell out of. I'd be supplying the addict a cheaper price for product so that I could use their house to sell out of. They would also refer a lot of other people to buy from me, and or they would help sell for me in return for product. So the incident happened in this addict's house. He, about 50-year-old man, had a girlfriend. The girlfriend had a little boy, maybe the age of 3, 4, or 5. I didn't ask either because I was ashamed of myself for not preventing his mother from using. This kid though, I felt like he was my little brother in some way. I would cook for him when he was hungry and his mom was always too messed up to do anything. One day, I go to work at the shack. It was a regular day. I get into the house, get my products ready, weigh out the stuff and bag them up. I knock on the bedroom door of the guy, homeowner. I see him sleeping. His girlfriend is also on the couch sleeping because she is always high and messed up. The kid is just sitting there watching TV. I make him some macaroni and cheese. Now I gotta wake up the guy because I need an update on what products he's moved the day before. So I go in his room. I see his eyes were still open. White foam all over him like he's overdosed. It's normal for me to see overdoses, but this was beyond an overdose. He's been overdosed for too long, which means he's dead. He was probably overdosed for at least 10 hours because I could smell it and he was cold to the touch. His vomit was dried and his eyes were dried. Now I'm in one of the biggest panics I've ever been in. As I'm trying to figure out what to do, I sit down with the kid and stay there until he finishes his mac and cheese, thinking about what I'm going to do next. His mom, sleeping behind me on the couch, is still alive but has no idea what had happened, or maybe she does, I don't know. I left the shack, drove about 2 blocks away, used the prepaid cell phone I have to call the police and report it, sat in my car until the police showed up. From that day on, I am anti-hard drugs. I still wonder about the little kid. He's probably 16 now without a mom. Every time I see the mac and cheese at the supermarket, I get this messed up feeling in my gut. And for the guy who died, I know I didn't kill him. I've accepted that, but could he have lived longer if I was never in his life? His life story was pretty amazing. He did cool things when he was young. He got into drugs when his mom passed away. He didn't have a dad though. One tip for anyone reading this: never judge a person on where they are in life, even if they are crackheads, as many people would say. Some people go through the most brutal situations and have no love and support to get on their feet. I'm glad I was able to be the man's friend before he died, and I know I treated the kid as a big brother or father, and I hope he remembers that part. This was a long time ago, and I've since gotten clean and started my own family. But there was a girl I knew who was homeless with her newborn son. On Easter weekend, I was walking on this trail to go meet with some people to sell them a sack. It started raining, and that, of course, made me mad. There's these bridges that cross over the top of the trail, and lots of kids gather and smoke or get spun under the bridges. And that's where I found her. She was passed out drunk with some random guy under the bridge while her newborn baby sat strapped in his car seat in the rain. He wasn't under the bridge. He was crying, and he looked dirty. I didn't have any children at this point, but I panicked seeing the little guy. I grabbed him, dropped all the stuff I was supposed to be selling, and walked off the trail and up the couple blocks to the police station. I told them what happened and where I'd found him. CPS took him and he ended up getting adopted. I had a dealer who I thought was alright at first. Eventually I started going to his house for a joint before going home with my bag. This was fine at first, but gradually became a bit of a living hell. He started screaming at his kids, they must have been 3 and 6, for anything. For walking into the room, for playing in another room, for making a loud noise, for asking a question. Even when they wanted a hug, he shouting at them and told them to stop being stupid and stop crying. This abuse extended to his partner. She was half his size and very thin. It was just verbal, but calling her an idiot, screaming at her in this low angry tone he took with his kids, talking through his teeth then exploding at the end of the sentence. She hated it, you could tell, but she put up with it because she didn't work and needed to support the kids who she loved. One day he got so mad, he held her against the wall and started choking her. I stood up and shouted, "What the duck are you doing?" He caught himself and backed away. She slumped to the floor crying, and he tried a pathetic attempt at damage control, telling her he's sorry but that it's her fault and telling me the same. I left there and then never went back. Called social services and gave them the address. Not too long and the police were there arresting him for something. I feel like I should have done something sooner when the red flags began, but there were unfortunately 2 things holding me back. 1. I was the only person who came around for joints, so he would know who called them. 2. I really wanted bud. I was so bad for it, and I really spiraled knowing I was a slave to the addiction. Ultimately that helped me kick it. Been clean for years now. Back in college I went over to a single mother's house to drop off some bud. The kid was 3 years old. I walk in and notice it is extremely smoky, and I immediately have a hard time breathing. It smelled like rotten feces, trash, and cigarettes. I was there for about 3 minutes and went to use the bathroom, where I noticed fresh and dried blood on the toilet and feces smeared all over the floors and up the walls. The feces was old and hardened, and dead bugs were in the corners of the bathroom and piled on top of the feces. But that wasn't the only icing on the cake. Once I left the bathroom, I went back out to the living room area and saw a big rat run right across the floor. Looked like we came right out of Ratatouille. Then the mother asked me if I wanted to take opioids, so I got the duck out of the house and called CPS. Former dealer here. It's been many years now, but I sold crack, heroin, pills, and cocaine as a teenager. I once had a lady come in the trap house with a newborn. She was literally selling herself and or her baby for a few rocks. When I saw the newborn in shitty diapers and dirty, I knew I had to give her a few rocks. I let her smoke and leave. I also called BCW Bureau of Children's Welfare on her as soon as she walked out. She lived on my street. I couldn't let her try to sell her baby. I couldn't let her keep it either. I just couldn't call the police. The baby was in a foster home less than a week later. The lady disappeared shortly after. I never saw her again. I hope she never got the baby back. She was a real piece of work. Have used, sold, and middleman Xanax, weed and blow for a long time when money is tight. The only time I've called CPS was when this chick, who is a regular, asked me to deliver to her house. I walk in, kid is asking for food. I think nothing of it. 4 hours later, she calls me asking for a front on a gram. I go back to do it. Kid is ornery and still asking for food. He's 6-7 years old. 3 hours later at 8 a.m., she calls me asking for another front on a gram. I go back to do it. She always paid eventually, and kid is worse off, still hungry, and now crying. At that point I refuse the front, go home, and call CPS. I want my profit, but not when I can tell you're ruining your life. If I see people getting out of hand, asking for fronts, neglecting kids, bills, etc., I tell them I'm dry or I drop contact entirely. I'm doing what I need to provide for me and my own, not trying to ruin someone else's life. I used to sell a smorgasbord of narcotics, been clean since 2014. Went to drop off to an acquaintance who phoned me. New location, so I went in with caution. Trash and scum everywhere, the smell was so foul. Kids running around, shit I had seen before, until I focused on the aquarium. It was full of used needles, some capped and some not. I mean, this was a 55-gallon tank with no lid and it was over halfway full. Called CPS next day. I'll never forget that.